So we're going to get started with some actual lab work finally. And so I want to run through a couple of basic measuring techniques that you're going to need to know for a lot of the lab work that we do. We're going to start real simple, and that is just measuring the lengths of things. And you've probably done this just in everyday life. Maybe something at home, you need to grab a tape measure and measure something. But in the science laboratory, maybe there's some things that you don't typically do when you're just doing things at home. So I'm going to hit a few of the important points, okay? So let's call this today measuring length. We're going to take probably about a couple weeks to do different measurement things. I'm going to mix some other stuff in at the same time, okay? So for today, again, just kind of starting simple, we're going to do measuring length. So here are a few important points when we're doing measurement in science class. We use the SI system. You probably are more familiar with the term metric, and I'm okay with you using metric instead of SI. SI is actually a French phrase for system international or international system. It's used pretty much almost completely around the world except in the United States. But in the science lab, we try to use the metric system. So, for example, since we're measuring length today, we'll use things like centimeters or millimeters. Or if we're measuring a longer distance, we might use a full meter and not inches and feet. Again, in the United States, we're more familiar with inches and feet and miles, and a very, very difficult system to use because you've got to memorize or look up like how many inches makes a foot, how many feet makes a mile, things like that. Okay. So another important technique is to check the zero end of your ruler or measuring instrument. We might use small rulers, we might use meter sticks, etc. Okay. Do not use the very end of a ruler to start a measurement. Let me show you what I mean by that. I've got a couple rulers here. Here's a normal meter stick that we use in the classroom, okay? And I want you to look and see where zero is on this. And it's sort of a trick question because you can't read the zero. They put this metal band over it. It's convenient for hanging it because it's got a little hole. It also protects the end. But I guess we just have to trust that the zero is down there at the very end. And that is how this is intended. But we would not want to start a measurement of something on that very end, okay? Similarly, for this more sort of traditional classroom ruler, okay, it's got inches on one side. Now, this you'll know the inches because there's typically 12 of them on the ruler, but we always want to flip it over. We're looking for the side that is broken into 10 pieces. So if you look at each of these numbers here, between each of the numbers, there are 10 smaller divisions. Whereas on the English side, it's more common to break it into fourths or eighths or sixteenths. In this case, there are 16 small markings in between each of the numbers. So stay away from the inches and stick with, you see what this says here? It says millimeters. That's the tiny little lines are millimeters. So each of the numbers, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, those are actually centimeters. So on a ruler like this, we would measure in centimeters, and then we would put a decimal place after that to talk about how many tenths of a centimeter or millimeters. That'll actually be my next point. But the point I want to make here is that you see how the zero is on the very end again? But over time, these rulers can get broken on the end, they can get worn down. So we don't want to use the end there. But on this one, you see how this one has, now this is kind of funny, they say centimeters on this one, but those are actually the numbered ones. So rulers are sometimes marked a little bit differently. But see how zero is not on the very end of the ruler on this one? it's kind of set in a little bit, that would be a case where you would want to use the mark on the end. You could start your measurement at 0 because it's not the very end of the stick. Okay? So what do you do if you have a ruler like this? Well, carpenters have a phrase. They call it burn an inch. That means whatever you want to start measuring. Let's say we want to measure from this line to this line. Instead of putting it like this, we would instead put it in a little bit and maybe start on the 5. Now, you have to remember what number you started at. So if this goes from 5 to about, I'd say, you see this funny marking that says 10 and then it says 1 again. Well, that's actually 11, 12, 13. So you do have to look carefully at the scale and make sure you know what you're reading. So this is almost right on the 11, but we have to subtract the 5 because that's where we started our measurement from. So this is actually closer to like 6.0, okay? But I always recommend you start on the 10. It's just easier to subtract 10 from things, okay? So if we put the line right there, started at 10, and then you see how the other end, now I'm seeing a little bit better here. That's right around the 5.9 mark or 15.9 mark, but we have to remember if this is 15.9, we're going to subtract 10 from it and call that length 5.9, okay? So again, in carpentry, where they tend to use inches, they might start it on the 1 inch mark and say, okay, it's reading 3 3/8, but they would subtract 1 and call this 2 3/8, okay? So you're just trying not to use the very end of the ruler if that's where 0 is marked, okay? All right, the third point. And this is for, in this class, for freshman science, okay? Because in upper grades, you might do something a little bit different. Measure so that the last digit is to the smallest marking okay? And that's typically, for a ruler, like the rulers I was showing you here, a 1/10 of a centimeter, okay? So again, let me show you what I mean by that. We look at the centimeter markings here. So we've got the numbers corresponding to centimeters, and then we have each of those broken into 10 little pieces. So we call those 1/10 of a centimeter. You can call them millimeters if you want to, but we're just probably going to find it easier to call them 1/10 of a centimeter. So that's why I was, here, let me go back here again. So let me line it up really nicely. See how we're right on the 5? Okay, so I would not call this 11. I would go to the 10th place because that's the smallest marking I have and say, well, is it right on the 11? In which case I'd call it 11.0. But I think in this case it's closer to 11.1. And so I would say 11.1 minus 5, which is 6.1. So 6.1 centimeters. Don't call it 6, and don't say 6.15 or something after that. If your smallest markings are 1/10 of a centimeter, then I want to see 1/10 of a centimeter, and that's all, okay? So let me do a couple examples just so you can kind of see how we go about making some kind of basic measurements. So let's say we want to measure the length of this ruler, which seems kind of silly, like we know the length of the ruler, right? Well, no, not really, because there is a little bit here at each end that's not part of the markings. So let's take another ruler, and we'll just put it on top of this one. And notice, because this one has 0 on the very end, I don't want to use the very end to start with. So I'm going to go, and I find it convenient to start at the 10 centimeter mark, okay? So I've got my ruler placed, so this end is right on 10. I'm being kind of careful. Hold it firmly down, and then I'm going to look at this end over here. Move my camera a little bit. You can maybe see a little bit better. So when I look right above it, I'm going to say that's right about at the 25.8 mark. Now notice I measured to 1/10 of a centimeter, 25.8, but because I started at the 10, I have to subtract that. So it's only 15.8. Okay, so 15.8, and always remember to write what you measured in. We call those the units. That would be the length of that ruler. Let's measure the dimensions of this Post-it note. So these are probably manufactured to be in inches, but we want to be measuring in centimeters. So I'm going to use this measuring instrument here. I like it. It's nice and clear. But notice you cannot use the very end because the 0 starts in a little bit. So I'm going to line my 0 up with one end. Okay, I think you can see that pretty well. Zoom in just a little bit here. There we go. And then at the other end, again, I'm going to estimate the 10th place. So I'm at 7 point. See how they put a little extra long line there in the middle? That would be 7.5. And I'm at the line next to it. So that's 7.6 centimeters. I don't need to subtract anything because I'm actually starting at the 0 mark. So 7.6 centimeters would be the length of that. Okay? So there's a couple examples. You'll have some to practice on your own. This, again, some of these techniques work for rulers, they work for thermometers, they work for balances. We're going to do some other measuring instruments later on after we get this down. Okay?